relevant legislation in line with the requirements of Article 18 of the UDHR by removing any indication of religious status on its ID cards. Finally, we wish to highlight that 2 years have now been passed since the abduction of Pastor Raymond Kah. We urge the Malaysian government to order a new independent investigation into this case and ensure that the perpetrators of this crime be brought to justice by ensuring the well-being and safety of all religious workers and their freedom to carry out their duties free from further threats, intimidation or violence. Thank you.
Thank you. I give the floor to Vivat International.
Thank you, Mr. President. Vivat International, Franciscans International and the Indonesian Zero Human Trafficking Network welcome the UPR outcomes of Malaysia and the acceptance of most of the recommendations regarding migrant workers and trafficking in person. However, we are still very much concerned about the human rights situation of migrant workers and victims of trafficking in person. Based on the available data for the period from 2013 to 2018, 34% of migrant workers who have worked in the domestic sector in Malaysia are Indonesian. Of these, 99% are women vulnerable to physical, psychological and sexual violence and exploitation due to excessive working hours. Indonesian migrants also work in other sectors such as palm oil plantation and construction work. They are often subjected to severe punishment and torture, even to death. They are denied decent salaries, right to holidays, right to change jobs or return home. From January 1st to March 13, 2019, 28 Indonesian workers from the East Nusa Tenggara province in Indonesia died in Malaysia due to illness, workplace accidents, alleged tortures, murder and economic negligence. On an average, 3 persons died per week. We therefore urge the Malaysian government to adopt and ratify the 1990 UN Convention on Protection of the Migrant Workers and Their Families, ILO Convention 189 and Palermo Protocol, to ensure security, healthcare, work safety for migrant workers, to investigate the cases of violence on all migrant workers, especially those coming from Entity Province in Indonesia, and bring the perpetrators to justice. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you. I give the floor to International Planned Parenthood Federation.
Thank you, Mr. President. This statement is delivered on behalf of RHAM, RFSU and IPPF. We congratulate the government's commitment towards the recommendations received at the third Universal Periodic Review cycle last year and applaud their approach of ensuring accountability while working closely with stakeholders and civil society organizations towards implementing the recommendations and moving forward, monitoring the progress of their implementation, as this also sets the tone towards achieving the Sustainable Development Goals. We celebrate Malaysia's commitment to respecting, protecting and fulfilling sexual and reproductive health and rights, namely ensuring universal access to stigma-free and friendly services for all people, especially unmarried women, adolescents and vulnerable groups. We underscore the importance of ensuring that every individual has the ability to fulfill their rights and have control over their bodies, their lives and their futures. We stress the importance of the commitment to reduce rising maternal mortality and to guarantee full access to safe abortions as provided for under the law, and we encourage the new government to maintain and scale up such efforts. We commend Malaysia's intention to enabling young people in Malaysia to be fully informed of their sexual and reproductive health and rights, so they are empowered to act and protect themselves through a full institution of a comprehensive sexuality education, well-funded and accessible to all. Finally, we would like to affirm the added value of a civil society's participatory approach and commend the new government's willingness to engage with civil society and acknowledging the efforts of those working for an inclusive agenda, namely the LGBTI and the sexual and reproductive health and rights communities. We are encouraged by the new government's approach to consulting and working with civil society organizations as a key ally for achieving progress in the Sustainable Development Agenda, including gender equality and sexual and reproductive rights in Malaysia. From our side, we stand ready to work in partnership with the government and all other stakeholders to ensure that these recommendations are implemented and all human rights and fundamental freedoms are guaranteed for all. Thank you.
Thank you. I give the floor to
This statement is made in consultation with a coalition of Malaysian NGOs working on SOGI issues. We welcome the 11 recommendations made to Malaysia by various member states on sexual orientation, gender identity and expression, and sex characteristic issues. We welcome Malaysia's acceptance of the recommendation to implement anti-bullying campaigns in school. However, we are deeply concerned that Malaysia noted the remaining 10 SOGI as recommendation. During Malaysia's UPR, the government affirmed that the LGBTQ persons deserve equal rights as citizens. However, many actions that the state has taken do not reflect that. There are multiple forms of state-sponsored violence, such as the Mukhayyam Conversion Therapy Camp, a 5-year action plan against LGBT persons, amongst others. The recent Women's March saw the creation of an environment of impunity for harassment, intimidation and hate towards LGBTQ persons. Sensationalized reports disproportionately focus on the participation of LGBTQ people in the march. This was followed by a swift condemnation by a minister, saying that it is an abuse of democratic rights for LGBTQ persons to assemble, and the Deputy Home Minister proposal to reform legislation on freedom of assembly. The government must take a strong stance against enabling incitement to hate and violence, to safeguard and defend the rights of all persons, in particular those who are already marginalized and prosecuted. We concur with our Foreign Minister's speech here in the United Nations 2 weeks ago that LGBTI issues are not a taboo, and we call for dialogue with the government on these issues. We also call on the Malaysian government to stop all form of state-sponsored violence against people based on their real or perceived sexual orientation, gender identity and expression, to stop politicizing and to protect LGBTQ persons from violence and discrimination, because we are all free and equal. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank you. I give the floor to the International Humanist and Ethical Union.
Thank you, Mr. President. We note that Malaysia has partially accepted recommendations from Brazil and the USA on protecting the right to free expression online. We are astounded, however, that it should reject Albania's modest recommendation that it take measures to fully guarantee the right to freedom of religion or belief. The rights to free expression and freedom of religion or belief allow for criticism of religious beliefs and ideas. This was confirmed by the UN Special Rapporteur on freedom of religion or belief in his most recent report to the Council. These rights are currently lacking in Malaysia. Articles 295 to 298A of the Malaysian Penal Code provide penalties for those who commit offences against religion. The penalties include up to 3 years in prison or a large fine. Last week, Alistair Kogia was sentenced to almost 11 years imprisonment for blasphemy on social media via his Facebook account. 3 others are being held without bail while awaiting trial for the same charges for insulting Islam and the Prophet. Muhammad Yazid Kong Abdullah, owner of the Yazid Kong Facebook account, pleaded guilty after he was charged in the Criminal Sessions Court. Chow Mun Fai, operating a Twitter account, faces 8 charges. Danny Antoni pleaded not guilty to 2 charges in relation to his personal Facebook account. In a statement about the cluster of cases, Inspector General of Police Fuzi Harun advised the public not to abuse social media by uploading or sharing any form of provocation touching on religious or racial sensitivities. Human rights law is clear. There is no prohibition on the questioning, criticizing or mocking of ideas and beliefs. Human rights protect individuals, not their ideologies. Accordingly, we urge Malaysia to reconsider its rejection of those recommendations calling for the right to freedom of religion or belief to be protected in the country, and call on it to repeal laws criminalizing blasphemy. We also urge the immediate overturning of the sentence against Alistair Kogia and the prompt release of the aforementioned men currently held in custody. I thank you.
I thank you. I give the floor to the International Service for Human Rights.
Thank you, Mr. President. ISHR delivers this statement in collaboration with Empower Malaysia, the Co-Secretariat of Comengo, or the Coalition of Malaysian NGOs in the UPR process. We appreciate that Malaysia has partially accepted recommendations from Uruguay and Lithuania to promote and protect human rights defenders, including by developing efforts to guarantee the freedom and safety of HRDs, and reviewing its legislation to ensure HRDs and journalists could freely exercise their right to freedoms of expression, both online and offline, association and peaceful assembly. This is essential. HRDs, and in particular women HRDs, still face significant challenges. Sisters in Islam, a member of Comengo, has been the subject of a fatwa declaring them a deviant group. When they tried to do when they tried to use the law to fight back, they were targeted with state-sanctioned harassment. We cannot stress enough, like what my colleague from ILGA just mentioned just now, that women HRDs, in particular LGBTQ persons in Malaysia, are under immense risk of state and non-state reprisals. This has to change. Reviewing relevant laws alone will not achieve the ultimate goal of ensuring HRDs, and in particular women HRDs, their fundamental freedom. The government of Malaysia should additionally take steps to acknowledge, promote and protect HRDs and fully implement the UN Declaration on HRDs. Comengo members' UPR report highlighted the need to enhance resources and make public the spending of training for government agencies on human rights and increase spending to ensure human rights education in public schools. Although this was not clearly reflected in the UPR recommendations, awareness raising on the universality of human rights is of utmost importance at the moment in Malaysia. Case in point, although discrimination is a daily issue, public misconceptions about the international treaties led the government of Malaysia to officially refuse to become a signatory to the ICED. We acknowledge and appreciate the progressive steps the government of Malaysia has taken since the inception of Malaysia Baru. However, much more needs to be done to facilitate a vibrant democracy and a safe and enabling environment for all defenders in Malaysia. Thank you.
Thank you. I give the floor to Civicus.
Thank you, Mr. President. Pusat Kemas and Civicus welcome the Government of Malaysia's engagement with the UPR process. But while we welcome the commitments of the Malaysian government to ratify all core UN human rights treaties during the UPR review, we regret the decision of the government in November 2018 not to ratify the International Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination. We are concerned by the lack of a clear timetable to ratify the other core treaties. We note commitments made during the UPR review to repeal the Draconian Sedition Act and other laws that restrict fundamental freedoms. However, since the review, we regret that a moratorium on the use of these laws has been lifted, and there have been arrests of individuals under the Sedition Act for exercising their right to expression. We are also concerned that the Sedition Act and the Communications and Multimedia Act have been used by the police to interrogate human rights defenders, including human rights lawyer Fadia Nadwa Fikri and Sivan Dorisami, the director of rights group Swaram, simply for expressing their opinions. The government has also failed to denounce racism and bigotry by opposition political leaders. We note that recommendations were made to respect freedom of assembly, including to review the Peaceful Assembly Act, which contains provisions inconsistent with international law. However, we are concerned that activists continue to face arrests for their involvement in demonstrations. Student activists Ashik Ali and Siti Nuriza were arrested for a peaceful sit-in at the Ministry of Education in September 2018. Mr. President, we call on Malaysia to implement recommendations accepted on protecting fundamental freedoms and immediately review or repeal all restrictive laws that undermine civic space, immediately halt their use against government critics, and to create an enabling environment for CSOs and for human rights defenders. Thank you.
Thank you. Amnesty International, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. President. Amnesty International welcomes Malaysia's accession to the Rome Statute of the ICC and calls on the government to strengthen human rights protections by ratifying the remaining core international treaties and removing reservations to treaties it has already ratified. We are pleased that the government will strengthen legislation to prevent torture and welcome its accept of a recommendation to end torture in prisons. We are disappointed, however, that the government has rejected recommendations to end the practice of caning of children in schools and of whipping under Sharia and common law. These practices constitute ill treatment and must be promptly abolished. We also call on the government to abolish laws that restrict freedom of expression, such as the Sedition Act, and to repeal or amend legislation that allows for preventive detention, such as the Prevention of Crime Act, the Prevention of Terrorism Act, the Security Offences Special Measures Act, and the Dangerous Drugs Special Measures Act. These laws are all rooted in the now abolished Internal Security Act and contain provisions that contravene international law. We acknowledge that the government has pledged to amend death penalty legislation. However, we are deeply disappointed that it has rejected recommendations to abolish the death penalty for all crimes, contrary to its promises. We urge Malaysia to reconsider these important recommendations. We regret that the government has once again rejected recommendations to protect the rights of LGBTI people and indigenous peoples in law and in practice. We call on the government to adopt legislation to recognize the rights of these groups and to end discriminatory practices towards minorities. Thank you, Mr. President.
Aye. Thank you. We've just heard the last speaker. We could accommodate. Before I give the floor to the Malaysian delegation for final comments, let me tell you that on the basis of the information provided, out of the 268 recommendations received, 148 enjoyed the support of Malaysia and 120 have been noted. As I said, I now give the floor to His Excellency Mr. Dato Amran Mohammed Zine for his conclusion. You have the floor, sir.
Thank you, Mr. President. The Malaysian delegation wishes to thank the distinguished delegates as well as Vice Chair of SOHACAM and representative of non-governmental organizations for their statements. We also thank the delegation who had inscribed to speak but unable to do so due to the time constraint. We highly value your support for the review of Malaysia. During the remaining time that is available to my delegation, Mr. President, I wish to refer to some of the points raised by some speakers. First, on the accession to Human Rights Convention, Malaysia is committed to ratifying the remaining core international human rights instruments. The interministerial committees have been established to advance the government's efforts in this regard. As the first step, the government is working on some of the low-hanging fruits. For example, the Conventions Against Torture and Convention on Enforced Disappearance. Second, on the issue of freedom of religion, the right to freedom of religion in Malaysia is constitutionally guaranteed. Our diversity is our strength. As a multi-religious nation, tremendous efforts continue to be undertaken to sustain peace and harmony in our country. Malaysia has placed necessary checks and balances through national policies and programs against acts of discrimination, stigmatization, stereotyping, hate crimes based on religion or belief. Although Malaysia is yet not a party to the ICCPR, Malaysia has enacted laws that are in conformity with Article 18 of the International Covenant. On the issue of discrimination, the government is looking into formulating a national harmony bill to further solidify efforts to enhance race relations among Malaysians and by promoting mutual respect, unity, reconciliation, integration and non-discrimination. Discrimination, hatred and racism have no place in Malaysia, and the government will not tolerate any action that is detrimental to the public order, peace and harmony. On the issue of gender equality, Malaysia acknowledges that gender equality and the empowerment of women through social, educational, economic and political status are vital. A special project team comprising representatives of government and civil society was established in March 2019 to draft a gender equality bill. Mr. President, the Honourable Minister of Foreign Affairs of Malaysia has highlighted to this Council that Malaysia is fully committed to the cause of human rights both at home and globally. The Honourable Minister also said that Malaysia has made progress, real progress, and that the new Malaysia will do more, and we would expedite and we would put a sense of urgency in doing more in the aspects of human rights. In the context of Malaysia's review, this is also aptly applicable to the determination of Malaysia to implement the UPR recommendations. And let me conclude by reiterating Malaysia's appreciation to all that have contributed to the review of Malaysia, to this Council and the Secretariat, as well as to all our partners in advancing our common efforts in support of the cause of human rights. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank you, Your Excellency, for your presentation and for having been involved in the Universal Periodic Review process. I propose that the Council adopt the decision on the outcome of the Universal Periodic Review of Malaysia as it now appears on the screen. I see an objection. The decision is adopted. We are now going to suspend the meeting very briefly before we move on to the consideration of the outcome of the Central African Republic's UPR.